Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble. Since we're live and we get some people in the door, we're going to listen to the intro music first. Thank you, courtesy of R.M. Brown.
Video too.
Yeah, there we go. All right, so we are here to discuss a big one. I am joined by Dr. Vincent Lynch of SUNY Buffalo, and he is a biologist who looks at ancient DNA, modern DNA. You work on things like ancient animals and mammoths, and you're also look at the health of animals and things like cancer development and stuff like that, cancer drug development. And so, yeah, it's an honor to have you here. I'm really glad to have you here.
No, happy to be here.
Yeah, and I came across you. I mean, we've been following each other on Twitter as two different scientists for a while, but I came across you again more recently because you've been especially critical of the Colossal Biosciences team and their de-extinction of the direwolf. And you're the first person I've seen actually to label it as a disinformation campaign. So I was intrigued by that, and I wanted to get you on to talk about that. Yeah, I mean, from my own perspective, I'm a zooarchaeologist. I study ancient animals, and I've had lots of problems with this too. And just because this is not as archaeological and my audience is used to archaeology, I came across this first on the Joe Rogan episode where the founder, Ben Lamb, was there. And here's what Ben Lamb has to say about archaeology.
Everyone.
Whoo, boy. And you know, that's the grandest of all conspiracy theories is that's how humans were created.
Yeah, that we were the panspermia. Or
well, either panspermia
or that we were engineered in place.
The great one is the Anunnaki, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's the Sumerian
I will, yeah, but I will say that if you look at, not to get too weird, but if you do look at the, it's like Kukulkan Khan and folks in if you look at some of the carvings from all over the world resembling their sky gods, there's a lot of weird similar. I mean, you can't objectively. It's like the guy with the Sphinx, right? That's like, yep, that's water. I'm an expert on erosion. That is water. And then they're like, head of the Sphinx, like, that's not water, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing as this. You cannot look at some of this stuff and say that's not weird, right? You can't look at like the incredible pyramids we have all over the world that seem to now there's like more and more discoveries, and then they get silenced out of it. It's like you can't see all that stuff and not wonder more, especially the stuff around. I've seen that. I've been there.
Oh, it's so frustrating.
Yeah. But also, it is such a weird world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm talking to you about like hardcore genetic science, but then when you start to look at all the craziness in archaeology, we don't know a lot.
Or a lot. Yeah. And there's no way you can know a lot.
And anytime you suggest something new, you get, shit for it.
Yeah, you get a rash of shit, and people try to connect you with the worst people in the world, hence Graham Hancock.
Yeah.
But
I think Graham Hancock in the end, I don't know if they're, kind of this advanced civilization or whatnot, but I think really smart people said things like Plato and others that were probably real.
Yeah.
I don't think they were just like playing around and like, oh, we're going to write something that's going to be in history as a joke forever.
You've seen the Reichart structure? You ever seen?
So I don't know about you, Vinny, but as an archaeologist, that is just straight up pseudoscience. Everything he just said that I clipped there was straight up pseudoscience. He called the field of archaeology crazy. He argued for what is essentially hyperdiffusionism, which is since pyramids look similar, they must have a common origin. And he even said, well, Plato, who's a philosopher, by the way, who wrote up tons of thought experiments like the allegory of the cave, why would he write history that's not real about something like Atlantis? And so it's just like, this is just totally misinformation and disinformation that's going out there. So that really raised my hackles about this. And since you're calling this disinformation, what's your take on de-extincting the dire wolf?
I mean, I basically totally agree. So lots of other people have spoken to the basic science of what they've done, and others have talked about sort of the ecological implications of what they've done. I'm more concerned about the effects of their propaganda is probably too strong of a word. The effect of their public relations on how people understand science and trust science, because what they've done is not resurrect a dire wolf. What they've done is use the method that was originally used to clone Dolly the sheep, and use that method and some genome engineering to create a transgenic gray wolf.
Okay.
That's by any definition a dire wolf.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like it's a gray wolf, like that's a few little changes and stuff like that.
I mean, it's sort of hard to know because they haven't published a paper yet, which is fine because lots of reasons, but they published a press release. So if we take them at their word, and there's no reason not to, what they did was sequence the dire wolf genome, or a few of them, identify genetic mutations, which are unique to dire wolves. If I remember right, there were 14 or 15 of them.
Something like that.
Yeah, and then they've identified 5 additional mutations in gray wolves, so a total of 20 mutations. And they've introduced those mutations into 14 genes. So 20 mutations into 14 genes. There's about...
So wait, one quick question. So if I remember, and we can play the clip maybe in a bit that you shared with me from their chief science officer, Dr. Beth Shapiro. If I remember, she mentioned that gray wolves and dire wolves share 95% the same DNA, if I'm remembering that right. So does 20 changes actually account for that 5% difference?
Oh, no, that would be like, there's millions of genetic differences between them.
Okay.
Depending on how you count, there's probably tens of millions of genetic differences between them. Without actually seeing the data, it's hard to know. But just do the math, right? It's 20 mutations out of tens of millions. So
yeah,
just as a sheer percentage, it's not a lot.
It's not a lot at all.
That's also not how we define species. The number of genetic differences between individuals in a population has nothing to do with how we define a species as being one thing or another thing.
So wait, what do you want to go into first? Let's hold off the defining of a species for a second, because that's gonna be complicated. And I agree with you. My whole interest in this is the public communication aspect. If we sort of look at their website and their introduction of it, they call this far from fiction. This is a verifiable essential apex predator, which they're calling a dire wolf, and it's cool stuff. I mean, it's really cool genomics. You're a professor who studies genetics. Would you say that the science itself is cool?
Yeah, I've even been quoted as saying the science is cool, and it is. The ability to make multiple genetic changes simultaneously using the method called CRISPR. It's called multiplex CRISPR editing. That's a really useful bit of technology. The ability to port methods, which are basically IVF, over to other animals is a really important bit of technology. The ability to do that has really important implications for species conservation, for conserving endangered species, not saying that you've resurrected extinct ones.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, CRISPR is definitely very cool. I think that's going to be the future of our children, right? That's what the movies teach us.
Yeah, I do worry about that. If they're successful, and I have no doubt that they will be, it will have profound implications for human health and disease.
Yeah.
If they are successful with developing the methods that they will need to sort of de-extinct things, multiplex genome editing, being able to derive sperm and eggs from sort of individual skin samples that they take, developing artificial wombs. If they're able to do that, it really profoundly changes human healthcare. Things like infertility are a thing of the past. So that's their real goal, right? Is the development of those texts and then spinning those off into individual companies. That's laudable. That's something that you want to do. What you don't want to do is lie about de-extincting things in order to garner press coverage that is almost overwhelmingly positive, that is almost never accompanied by critiques from outside experts.
Yeah, that's actually so. Okay, let's play that video that you shared with me of Dr. Beth Shapiro, which, by the way, she is a very legitimate scientist. In fact, I just finished marking an honors paper for one of my students here at Cardiff University on the domestication of dogs, where she is cited in there. Right? She is a very legitimate scientist, ancient DNA scientist, and so yeah, like in that sense, I don't want to. And also for full clarity, I sent her an email and invited her on to join this conversation, and she did not reply. I'm not sure if I had the right email address, so I'm not going to blame her. But because I sent it to her faculty email, and she's now affiliated with this company, Colossal Biosciences. But I did try, and I also invited Ben Lamb, the founder, and I said to him if Beth Shapiro could come on too. He never replied to me on Twitter, though he was replying to one of my colleagues who was arguing with him slightly, but he ignored me entirely. He very clearly, consciously ignored me.
He's responded to me on Twitter a couple times.
Has he? Okay. No, he very clearly here. I can even show the conversation really quickly. Well, no, let's play this first because
not without some controversy. With
so here
critics
they are
saying it's a PR stunt that doesn't actually prove Colossal is any closer to bringing back the woolly mammoth.
The woolly mice is a proof of technology. It's not a PR stunt. What this proves is that our end-to-end process of taking data from, DNA, identifying genes that drive core traits, and so it is a proof of technology. And then the direwolves are just one step further beyond that.
Colossal keeping their direwolf project secret from the world for more than 18 months.
How did this happen? We're making a list of what are the cool animals that are extinct that people would be interested in, and the direwolf comes up.
At the time, there wasn't enough direwolf DNA available to succeed. Beth's team extracted higher quality DNA from fossils, and what came next was a breakthrough.
At that moment, when we saw those first lines of computer code that told us that we had wolf DNA, I knew we were going to be able to do this project.
Colossal electing to use a gray wolf as the base for their dire wolf.
So we've taken a gray wolf genome, a gray wolf cell, which is already genetically 99.5% identical to dire wolves, and we've edited those cells at multiple places in its DNA sequence to contain the dire wolf version of the DNA. We have an embryo. Then we put that embryo into a surrogate mom, and that embryo develops into a fetus and then is born. That animal looks like a direwolf, it will behave like a direwolf, and it is a direwolf.
Colossal's chief animal officer.
So there's a lot of stuff there. First off, I made a mistake earlier. It's 99.5% similar. So, but it's still 20 genomes, 20 changes is not a lot.
That difference is on the order of like human chimp.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody put in there 98.5% is chimps in the chat. So, okay, but they definitely very clearly call it a direwolf. That is what Dr. Shapiro calls it right there. And they have been very adamant about that claim until fairly recently in New Scientist, where New Scientist, like you said, most media has just very much accepted this uncritically. New Scientist was one of the few that actually pushed back early on. And Dr. Shapiro, in this recent article, claimed that actually these are gray wolves. It's not possible to bring something back that is identical to a species that used to be alive. Our animals are gray wolves with 20 edits that are cloned. So I guess this is partly due to you and the range of other people.
I hope, but the problem is the original press claimed, like, it was Wired Magazine, The Atlantic, and I can't remember the third one. Wired Magazine, The Atlantic.
New Yorker.
The New Yorker, there it is.
Yeah.
The headlines say direwolf. The text says direwolf.
Yeah.
The press release says direwolf. None of those things said transgenic gray wolf, which is what they really are. And then they say, colloquially, we're calling them direwolves.
Their website still says direwolf.
Yeah.
right? It doesn't say gray wolf almost anywhere. It says they're similar to today's gray wolves, but it very clearly calls them the new lineage of direwolves. Their species is labeled as direwolf. Right here, this is how it's labeled on their website today. I'm not. This is not a Wayback Machine. This is how it is today. Yeah,
Even
and that's how.
there, in that
Yeah.
image you showed, demonstrates the real intent of the coverage, right? That direwolf is called Khaleesi.
Mm-hmm.
It's meant to evoke Game of Thrones. Their press release is associated with George R.R. Martin cuddling one of these pups. Their press release is associated with 2 of the pups asleep on the Iron Throne, right? This is about marketing. It's not about the real science that they're using to do this.
Which, to be frank, if they were portraying the science honestly, I have no problem showing cute pups. I have no problem getting George R.R. Martin there. In fact, I thought it was hilarious. George R.R. Martin is a co-author on the preprint paper on the ancestry and evolution of the extinct direwolf. George R.R. Martin is right here. Instead of writing the next book of Game of Thrones, he is writing this article right here, this scientific article that he very clearly contributed to with his fictional universe.
I'm sure his fans are upset about that. I mean, if you go to the very, very end, very end, there's something called the credit, which allows you, there's something called credit attribution, which says what role you played in this scientific paper. That's really important because it allows you to assign responsibility for that aspect. So we as scientists are responsible for making sure that that thing we did is true and credible. So if I remember, he's listed as a funder.
Funding acquisition.
Oh, an investor.
Where is it?
Oh, where did it even go? I saw it before.
I don't even see him on here.
I found him once, but my eyesight isn't very good. So if he's not even listed, but you know, that again is part of the. I'm sure it's listed. I just can't find it.
Yeah.
But again, that's part of this idea that, you know, we're trying to associate the dire wolves with a fictional character that we call the dire wolf,
as opposed to what dire wolves actually were. So this actually is what I argued or tried to argue, though Ben refused to reply to me. He made a tweet here that says, most people do not even know the classification of the vast majority of the phylogenetic tree is based solely on morphology, and most has not been sequenced, meaning genetically, even though, of course, Colossal has more direwolf DNA and analysis than anyone in the world. And my point is, dude, this is misleading. I study animal bones from this period and later on. And the way that we morphologically identify species is through the shape of their bones, especially extinct species, which we don't have their flesh, we don't have their fur, we have the morphology of their skeletons. And it's like they didn't do anything in their genetic modifications to actually alter the bones, which is how we morphologically identify direwolf specimens, right? And so, you know, we have a lot. Do you know where most of our direwolf specimens in the world come from, Vinny?
La Brea, if I remember correctly.
Yes, exactly. They come from La Brea tar pits. Here's some photos of them. This is how many were trapped in there, that they actually have literally a wall of direwolf skulls right here. And
beautiful.
It's absolutely phenomenal. And there's this awesome article called The Bacula of Rancho La Brea. Bacula are penis bones. And anyone familiar with this channel knows that I have a video called the top 6 archaeological penis bones ever found. And this is actually my last example. And actually, it's this one right here. This one right here is a direwolf that had broken its penis bone, which probably means it was attacked while mating. Yeah, it's fractured. It's nasty. Yeah, I'm glad we don't have penis bones anymore.
It looks like that one healed, though, which is pretty remarkable.
It is. That's actually what's so cool, because this doesn't happen very often with dogs and these kind of species, because they have this urethra in here. So yeah, but it does happen with some other carnivores. walruses and stuff like that, where there's a few broken examples and healed. And but in this image, these top ones, this is direwolf penis bones, bacula. These are gray wolf bacula. So we can tell the difference morphologically between the penis bone of a gray wolf and a dire wolf very clearly, because dire wolf penis bones are 4 times larger. And so if Beth was here, I'd be like, so are your dire wolf penis bones modified to be 4 times larger? Because if they're morphologically dire wolves, they need to have those large schlongs.
I mean, they need to have every other thing that makes a dire wolf look like a dire wolf.
Yeah, it's very true. And so what did they change that makes them look sort of like a dire wolf, or what we think a dire wolf looks like?
So again, we don't have a scientific paper that describes it, but their press release describes some of the changes that they made. So they made changes in some genes that we think are responsible for body size. We have a pretty good idea of genes that are responsible for body size from other dogs, like canids. So we know like FGF signaling is important for body size, and insulin signaling is important for body size. So they made changes in those genes. So you could at least say that you identified those changes in dire wolves and introduced them into wolves to give wolves the dire wolf appearance. One of the problems that I have with what they've done, I have lots of problems with what they've done, is they made genetic mutations in genes that are associated with fur color.
Yeah.
Specifically to make them appear white. Because they want to make them look like a Ghost from Game of Thrones. We don't really know the coat color of dire wolves. You could infer it from the genome. Probably they just looked like every other wolf. And there's a lot of variation in wolf coat color. Some very, very dark, some to almost pure white. So it's probably the same thing, right? There's a lot of variation. They don't have that variation because they have only a few genomes. So make it look like Ghost there.
Yeah, it's eye-catching, right? Because it looks different than what we think of as most wolves, let's say.
Yeah.
And so it really sticks out like that Game of Thrones character Ghost. And you can see that which I guess, like I said, I don't mind having George R.R. Martin in their press release to try to make, science more accessible and attractive for ordinary people. But it actually seems like they're driving their science based on what they think will appeal to the public.
I mean, it almost has to be if that's what they're doing. They're naming it Romulus and they had 3 that were successfully born. They named them Romulus and Remus. Fine, the founders of Rome. Sort of makes sense because they were nursed by a female wolf back in the mythology. They were nursed by a female wolf. The Khaleesi one is specifically meant to evoke sort of an emotional response to Game of Thrones fans. Having George R.R. Martin hold it is meant to do the same thing. Having them asleep on the Iron Throne is meant to do the same thing. That's okay if the intent is to get people engaged in science, but you have to be intellectually honest about what you're doing. And so you have to be intellectually honest about it, and then you have to justify it, right? Before you do all of this, what's the justification for making transgenic clones of gray wolves? Because they're not dire wolves. So why are you going through this process?
Okay, let's get there in 2 seconds. Let's move back to what I think is one of the important things that they're misinforming, which I said we'd get to, which was the definition of species, right? And this to me, so listen to Ben Lamb, the founder and fundraiser, describe to Joe Rogan how we define species.
Like I said, there's 6 different ways. There's actually a species definition that's based solely on geographics. And there's a funny paper out there around one species of toad that they built a road through, and the same toads live on 2 sides of the street, and they're different species. And they're the same fucking toad.
Just because there's a road.
Just because we as humans change. It's called geographic isolation of speciation. So it's just crazy. And so the only arguments that we now have is, but is it a mammoth? And it's like, well, then don't call it a mammoth. I asked people, I was like, did you see Jurassic Park? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, what was Jurassic Park? To your question, what do you think? What was Jurassic Park about to you?
Me?
Yeah. If you're going to take your kids to see Jurassic Park, what is the movie about?
Dinosaurs.
Is it? because they took ancient DNA and they mixed it with a bunch of other stuff. Are they dinosaurs, or are they genetically modified animals, GMOs, genetically modified organisms that have inserted genes from lots of different things, or are they dinosaurs? If they serve the ecological function, this is what's called functional de-extinction. If they serve the ecological function and they have the lost biodiversity and phenotypes that made that animal unique, like the polar and a bear, they're just that animal. So this starts the whole religious and philosophical debates, where it's funny because the scientists who should not fall into these philosophical debates, when they don't like what you're doing, that's what they go to.
So what was the argument? How did they present it?
It's just like by their own definition, they're like, well, it doesn't have enough DNA. So I was like, if I said, but the second dire wolf that we have, or the second genome that we have from the tooth has less of the same DNA than the skull. Does that mean that it wasn't a dire wolf? And it just turns into an you're missing the point conversation. It's like, I'm just asking questions.
I would like to know the point, though. What is her point?
Their point.
Like, what is her overall argument?
The general point of the people is that they want to pick one speciation definition and adhere us to that. And if you do that, no animal, including our animals, will fall into one species, right? It's just people that are using the framework that they set that isn't consistent, kind of against based on the argument that they want to make.
Interesting. So species is just something.
It's a human construct. It's not.
And it's just a thing if it can breed with another thing.
Well, I mean, that is one definition. There is another definition saying that it's only a species if it can't breed with another thing. Oh. So if I genetically modify them to make it where they can't breed with wolves, does that mean they're now their own species? Like, it just gets into this dumb philosophical perspective because we made up this construct.
Right. But as a person who studies biology,
all right. As a person who studies biology, did he effectively teach anything to the public in that word salad?
No. So first of all, Jurassic Park isn't about dinosaurs. It's about hubris. Hubris in the pursuit of profit, which started to sound a lot familiar because that's what Colossal is doing. It is true that there are lots of species concepts. Depending on how you count, there might be like 4 to over 20. And there's a lot of debate over what it means to be a species. And what definition you apply sort of depends on the situation that you're in. So he said that, there's a species and we built a road and now there's one species on one side and one species on the other side. I don't believe that's true. I would like to have the citation for that example. It could be true if the road was so big that the population on the one side can't get to the population on the other side forever and always, right?
And they isolate for long enough that they evolve long enough that therefore they become two different species on other definitional levels.
Yeah. So that would be, so if they can never mate with each other, then they're reproductively isolated, sort of alleles can't get from one side to the other. That's one definition of a species. Given enough time, they'll accumulate mutations that prevent them from mating with each other. So in this case, you might say that, yes, they are a species according to one species concept because there's no gene flow between them. But that's only one species, and it's situationally appropriate for that example, right? And then there are lots of other ones which are situationally appropriate for other examples. You could be someone like me, and I get a lot of biology is very philosophical. Someone like me, it really is in ways that other sciences
Of course, yeah. Personally, I think all sciences are very philosophical. They come out of philosophy in many ways. And as he mentions, this is a human construct. Look, everything we talk about, language creates human constructs. So as soon as we start defining things and labeling them, that's a human fucking construct. That's just how it goes. And so,
I totally agree. Because in the class I teach, we discuss species a lot. And what I do is ask my students to close their eyes. And then I ask them to imagine an apple.
Okay, I'm doing it.
And then describe it. And they all know what an apple means, right? We close our eyes and think apple. We all have the same impression of what an apple is. If we all close our eyes and think about what silver is, we understand what silver is. If we do the same thing for gold, we all understand gold. If we do the same thing for lead, we all understand lead. Species are not like chemical elements. They don't have they can't be defined by themselves. So there is some philosophy there.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they're not real. And that doesn't mean that their definition of if it looks the same, it is the same is a valid definition. And their definition of if
like
it
fucking pyramids.
well, I mean, there are a lot of good scientists there who should know better, because there's this thing that we call mimicry in the natural world, where one species evolves to look like another species. And it's
Convergent evolution.
yeah. And there's different reasons for doing it. For example, if you're a species of butterfly that tastes bitter, birds and other predators learn to avoid you because you taste bitter. In such a scenario, other butterflies might evolve to look like the bitter butterfly, because the birds learn not to eat the bitter butterfly, and they see a butterfly that looks just like it, and they don't eat that one, right? So this is a kind of mimicry that is really, really common. And sometimes it is so close, the mimics, that you really can't see the difference. One of the best examples of this is a monarch butterfly and a viceroy butterfly. I can't tell the difference between them. I'm sure a specialist who knows the difference would be able to, but I can't. That doesn't mean they're the same species, because they're indistinguishable to us. And it doesn't mean that. Yeah. Like, they look almost exactly the same.
Yeah, they really do. I never knew that. Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing with certain bones. Even I was talking about the morphology of bones. I just finished teaching master's level zooarchaeology this term, and so it's like, certain species, they're just so similar that you have very tiny criteria that you really need to be a specialist to be able to get, like sheep versus goat, or dire wolves versus gray wolves. They're so similar, with the exception, obviously, the penis bone and the sagittal crest and a couple other things, that they are very, very similar, despite having been isolated from one another for a while. And so
infuriating, because according to them, species that look the same are the same, or individuals that look the same are the same. And that's self-evidently not true.
It just confuses all of the science, and that's been a lot of my issue. Is it's just that, like, it's a bunch of word salad that doesn't teach anything and confuses everybody for the sake of hyping up their own claims.
Well, it misrepresents the science in such a way that it causes the public to understand something that isn't true. Right? That no biologist accepts the definition that if things look the same, they are the same. But by misrepresenting that, they're getting the public to believe that that's something that scientists take seriously. And we don't take that seriously. Eventually, we have scientific debates about this, and eventually it'll come out that, nobody believes that these things are dire wolves. But what's the public going to believe? They read the headlines that says the dire wolf is back. And they're not going to read headlines that say, oh, this is not true.
Yeah, so I agree with you.
Science.
And like I said, as a zooarchaeologist, I want to quibble with you for a second. We do define species based on how their skeletal remains look. And so that's different from how their fur coats look and stuff like that. It's why I actually asked Google, did they change the size of the penis bone? And no, according to Google's AI, there's no evidence that they did, because that would be actually trying to change these gray wolves to match how we morphologically identify a dire wolf, which is from their skeletal shapes, if you see what I mean.
I do. And that's what makes Ben Lamb's comment about most species being identified based on their morphology technically true, because almost everything that has ever lived is extinct. And if you want to classify them, then you have to use sort of the rock record. But that's not how we do it for living species, and gray wolves are living. So that's not a definition we would use for living species.
Yeah, but and since dire wolves are extinct, though, if we wanted to morphologically identify them, we'd have to change those skeletal structures, because that's how we actually do that. So, all right, you're a geneticist. I actually don't know. Is there a genetic way of determining different species? Like, is there some certain level of distance or that actually would make a criteria for species definitions? I actually don't know this, and I should.
Well, that's the problem, is that there's lots of definitions of species. So some of them would say that, if you have a certain number of genetic differences and you're reproductively isolated from each other, then you're a species. Among the first hard species concept was given to us by Mayer, one of the sort of founders of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, and he developed something called the biological species concept, which is two species are species if they mate and the offspring is infertile. And why that's important is it prevents genes from flowing from one population to the other. That's a really like hard definition, but there are all sorts of sort of more lax ones. Some of them are that, you know, there are a certain number of genetic differences. We can make family trees of them. And if we look at the family tree, we can see that there's not, look at the family tree, we see that they're split and there's no going in between. Then that's a valid definition of a species. That's sort of a pure genetically based one.
Okay,
There
that makes
are
sense.
many others.
Yeah, and I guess you probably do a bunch of like, I don't know what, like multivariate statistical analysis to try to create those, like principal component analysis or something like that.
I mean, you would do that. Yes, you could do that. You could use phylogenetic methods, which are methods that you can line up DNA from one species to another species, find the genetic differences that are unique and different between them, and determine based on that sort of sequence comparison in a phylogenetic tree, a family tree, whether there's interconnections between them, sort of incomplete lineage sorting, we call it, or hybridization events. Those things are relatively common in the early part of speciation, but as speciation continues, those things become less and less frequent. So then you would say, oh, look, the gene flow between the one and the other has stopped. It doesn't mean that it's technically not possible, but it's not occurring anymore.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And it's sort of, you know, we have this tricky issue with canids anyway, because domesticated dogs can mate with both coyotes and with gray wolves, creating these chi-wolf things that are existing now in America, these sort of hybrids. And so there obviously this mating definition is a tough one, especially as we keep looking further back and we see humans mating with Neanderthals and Denisovans and other types of species. It really does. It does show that, hey, our definitions of species are difficult to work with, but they aren't something that we just use conveniently for a press release. Is maybe.
Unfortunately, I have to agree with Lem. Species concepts are conceptual abstractions that we have invented to describe the world around us. That doesn't mean that they're not biologically based in hundreds of years of sound theory and empirical studies.
Yes.
We have a reason for each species definition, and their definition is not one of them. But they say it enough, then the general public who's not familiar with these really esoteric and complex definitions of species will believe that their species definition is correct. And if you do that, then you end up in the weird situation where the Secretary of the Interior says, well, we can take species off the endangered species list because we can just bring them back. And that is absolutely not true. That is disinforming the public about what is possible. And it has real world consequences. And if those consequences are taken to the extreme, then they're undoable. We will let species go extinct, and they're not coming back because de-extinction isn't real.
Yeah, I saw that. The Secretary of the Interior basically says we can cut the endangered species list because of this, which is just like, you have to be kidding me. We should not be informing our biological conservation based on this one new development, which is really cool genetic modification, but it certainly does not solve the issues with biodiversity and extinction that exist in our world right now, as we face so many species becoming endangered and extinct because of climate change and development and stuff like that. Yeah.
Well, it actually makes it much worse.
Yeah.
They either don't know, Colossals either doesn't know, or they know and they aren't telling us. There is no way, literally no way, that they are going to be able to rewild those dire wolves. As you said, canids aren't reproductively isolated. Those dire wolves, if they escape or if they are released, because they're not dire wolves, they're transgenic clones of gray wolves, will be able to mate with other gray wolves. And that will spread those mutations that they've introduced into the gray wolf population. So that leads to sort of a funny thing and a really sad, profound thing. The funny thing is that, okay, are gray wolves that mate with these transgenic clones and get a gene from them that is a direwolf gene, are they now direwolves? What if they don't
Ah!
what if they don't get all 20? What if they get
Wait. What if they mate with a Kai wolf and now it's a dire Kai wolf?
Exactly. This is what actually can have a real world, profoundly negative consequence. Red wolves, which are critically endangered, right? There's maybe 15 in the wild and a couple hundred in captivity. They can mate with coyotes and gray wolves. Colossal says that part of the reason that they're doing this is to help the critically endangered gray wolf population increase in size, because it's important for conservation. But if they
mean
let
the critically endangered red wolf population?
Red wolf, sorry,
yeah. No, you're good.
Critically endangered red wolf. There's like 15 in the wild. But if their transgenic clones get out into the wild and mate with gray wolves, and those wolves can mate with coyotes, and they both can mate with red wolves, now you've introduced dire wolf mutations into red wolves, which isn't helping them, right? You're turning them into something else. If we follow the colossal definition to the extreme, then those red wolves are now dire wolves.
And they're now extinct because now they've become something else, which, oftentimes when a species goes extinct, it doesn't, in the past I'm talking about, it doesn't always die out. It actually just, it becomes something else slowly. And so, this is what's happening is you're hastening that with this tiny population that's still around.
I mean, from my perspective, you're whitewashing it. You're saying that, we're doing this really important thing for conservation while we're doing this other thing, which is genetic engineering of all kinds of things, and mislabeling them and calling them an extinct species when they're really not. And again, the public is going to read the headlines and think that the impossible is possible, which has implications like saying we don't need to conserve endangered species anymore. Or we can create entirely new things when that's not possible, at least not yet.
Yeah. I mean, and they're working on a number of different species. And so are you, so all right, let's think about this since you're actually much closer to their research than I am. You think that their genetic modification is quite cool. What do you think should happen to the organisms that are created?
So the method that they used, multiplex genome editing, is very useful. I think there's no point in doing it to make transgenic clones of gray wolves that have dire wolf DNA. There's just no justifiable reason for that. So don't do it. It's one thing to introduce a bunch of mutations into a mouse as a proof of concept that you can give them long, wavy hair and just keep those in the lab forever. Like, it's a proof of concept that you can do something. That tells us something about the genetic changes that are required for morphological appearances.
Okay. So in a sense, it's a proof of concept that we can do this kind of editing. We can isolate the genes and we can prove that these genes that we think relate to these kind of phenotypes actually do.
Yes, but even here they're misleading. So what they did was identify mutations that were already associated in mice with hair phenotypes, either making them longer, wavy, or changing the texture, and introduced a bunch of them into one mouse. So it's not even really a proof of concept because we already knew that those mutations in mice were associated with hair changes.
Okay.
They just put them all in one mouse, which doesn't make it a mammoth, right?
But it's a proof that we can do this, I suppose, is the proof that we can edit all these different genes, because obviously things like hair, size, etc., that's controlled by a wide range of different genes, not just one, not just two, but like dozens, hundreds even. And so they're showing
it's proof that multiplex genome editing, which is a useful thing, actually works. So that's useful.
So that's good. But trying to create these weird new hybrid species is not accomplishing anything useful for conservation.
No, it can't, right? Because the point of conservation is you're trying to keep a species, by whatever definition that you're using, sort of unique into itself. The problem is that the number of those unique into themselves individuals is decreasing so low that they might be gone forever. None of the tools that they're developing for sort of de-extinction are going to solve that problem.
Okay. What kind of problems could they solve?
Well, they developed a method called but the method that they used for cloning is called somatic cell nuclear transfer.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do is it's exactly the method that they used to clone Dolly, the sheep. You take an egg, you remove the nucleus from that egg. You take a nucleus from a different cell and you put it in that egg. And then you let the egg grow for a little bit until it becomes an embryo in a dish. And then you implant that egg into a surrogate. So you do basically a little bit of cloning and then IVF.
Okay.
So they developed that method, and that is useful for increasing the number of individuals of red wolves, because now you can do cloning of red wolves. That's a useful thing.
Yeah.
But they said that they did it using their de-extinction pipeline. But like, they could have done that without any reference to de-extinction, and it still is a useful thing for conservation.
They could have literally just created more red wolves and said this is going to increase their population. They could have even looked at red wolf DNA from dead individuals to increase the biodiversity of the living red wolf population.
If they wanted to, sure.
Yeah. Which would be...
That's not what they're claiming they've done, right? They've done that. If you read the press release, they talk about that, but it's at the very bottom.
Okay.
It's at the bottom of the press release, and everything above it is about direwolf, direwolf, direwolf.
So the other thing this company's become very big on, and this is where I first came across them a few years ago, is they really want to de-extinctify a mammoth, which is totally up your area of research. And I've seen that you've written some Twitter threads on that, as well as Tori Herridge. So just to play devil's advocate, one of the arguments that I've read about why to do this is because with mammoths, you can actually introduce them into areas where they could modify and rewild the landscape. Is that a different kind of argument that's useful or not?
It's not useful. It's a different kind of argument. So one of the definitions of a species that they use is two individuals are the same species if they perform the same function in the environment.
Yes, that's the functional definition.
Yeah. And what they're proposing is to genetically modify Asian elephants to give them the superficial appearance of a woolly mammoth, and presumably make some changes that change their behavior. That's a really, really challenging thing to do because we know very, very little about the genetics of behavior. Let's say they're able to do it. And then the argument is you have some of these genetically modified Asian elephants that look like woolly mammoths, and you put them back in the Arctic, and they'll perform a function. That function is the permafrost is melting, and permafrost stores vast quantities of greenhouse gases. So as it melts, it releases those greenhouse gases, which makes global warming worse, which makes the permafrost melt more, and you get into this feed-forward cycle where it makes global warming very difficult to solve. Mm-hmm. What they're arguing is that if you rewild woolly mammoths into the Arctic, they will be able to perform this ecological function of tramping down, like literally their weight pushes down the permafrost, which actually does have a function in sort of maintaining it being frozen. I don't know how many mammoths you need to do that, right? So when mammoths were at their peak population size, they were distributed across the entire northern hemisphere, right? How many mammoths do you need for them to perform this ecological service? It's not 10, it's 100, it's not 1,000, it's not 10,000, it's probably tens of millions.
You got to produce a large enough viable population, A, that can continue itself, B, that can actually transform a large enough amount of the terrain to have an actual impact.
And what if they don't like it there? Right?
Yeah.
So this is an entirely theoretical argument. One that,
especially because the landscape's not the same as it was, 10,000, 20,000 years ago.
No, and so I've asked, and they said that they have, and if they have, they haven't released whether they've performed any ecological modeling or environmental impact assessments to demonstrate that this is feasible, and if it is feasible, what number of mammoths would they need, and given a certain number of mammoths, how much would that reduce carbon emissions? Mm-hmm. They've not released any study that says that they would do that, or says what it would take to do that. And it's like, I'm not the first person to ask that question. There's a video of Lamb at the Explorers Club giving a discussion about this. And the very first question that's asked, and it's a really prescient question, is have you done any modeling to show that this is true? And if so, have you done any modeling to show that this won't actually be negative for those environments? There's no guarantee that putting the mammoth back in that environment will have a positive outcome, right? It's really bad ecology and really bad evolution to assume that putting the mammoths back there will have a positive effect. The environments have been evolving for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, in the absence of mammoths. They've evolved away from needing mammoths. So if you put them back there, that's not restoring what was. It's introducing an exotic invasive species into an environment it's never been in before.
Yes, and we've seen what happens. There's a lovely Simpsons episode. And we've seen what happens in Americas and in Australia and elsewhere, that when you introduce random species into an ecosystem that's not used to supporting them, that there's all sorts of unintended consequences.
But again, it's a way of misleading the public, right? It is actual disinformation, because you're saying that we will be able to prevent global warming if you let us do this.
Yeah.
So then people believe that that's possible. And if that's possible, then why do the things now that are hard that you actually need to do to prevent global warming?
You mean like stop emitting fossil fuels?
Yeah, or anything else, right? Like, you know, that there are certain things that you can do that will prevent global warming. All of them are inconvenient.
Yeah.
So why don't we just put mammoths back there? Because if the public believes it, it must be true. Because, hey, listen, Colossal was founded by George Church, who's an incredibly intelligent person who you know, honestly is a genius. He's developed all these cool biomedical technologies. Ben Lamb is really charismatic, even though I disagree with almost everything he says. And Beth Shapiro is a really well-respected biologist. So if these well-respected, important people are telling the public that we can do these things, of course they're going to believe them, right? Yeah. It's intentionally misleading the public to believe that the impossible is possible. And it's already having negative consequences.
Yeah. So, all right, I got a quick question for you. I should have asked you beforehand. How long do you have?
Forever.
Okay, then let's keep chatting. So, yeah, this is, I think, this is one of my biggest issues. This is partly why I started this channel. This is why I went on Joe Rogan to talk about with Graham Hancock, is we see this exact sort of thing happening time and time again of the public being misinformed about what science is. And so often it seems to be trying to distract us from things like global warming, climate change. You know, even Graham Hancock's ideas, we understand climate change in the past and its impact on ancient civilizations. But what he does is he says, no, we shouldn't be worried about that. We should be worried about an impact from outer space, you know, and we should be, but we know that global warming is happening, so we need to do something about that. It doesn't mean we can't keep looking at space and checking out if something might impact us. And I mean, so
asked that certain civilizations declined and fell because the environment changed, right? Yeah. Like one of the many contributions that led to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was the environment was changing. Same thing for the Aztecs, same thing for the Maya. We live in a changing world, and you just have to deal with it. You have to adapt to it, or you don't.
Yeah, and since we actually understand in this case, you know, I had a great conversation with Paul M.M. Cooper, author of The Fall of Civilizations, where we touched on a lot of this. And like, you know, one of the big differences is we now know the climate is changing and we know why it's changing. So unlike in the past where it takes, you know, generations to figure that out and adapt to it and whatnot, we can actually do something about it. And instead we're focused on, I don't know, de-extinctifying the dire wolves and the mammoths. And it's just such a distraction from what the majority of the scientific community is telling us. And I don't know, it just enrages me.
But one of the other things that enrages me is that the way that this has been covered by the news media, those in Wired, they had no outside experts to critique what the people who did the study were saying, right? They didn't interview a bunch of people. They don't have to interview me. A bunch of people who are experts in these fields to be able to say, no, these claims aren't true, right? So Colossal is responsible. Ben Lamb is responsible. Beth Shapiro is responsible. And so are the news media, because they aren't being critical in their coverage. And every day there's a news story that comes out with no critical coverage, with no outside experts to check what they are saying.
Yeah, no, this is one of my biggest issues for a long time with how archaeology is covered. We saw this, for example, there's a question actually from my patrons for you. Or actually, it's more of a comment, but it's about the home and the lady controversy. Whereas the same thing, it was, just immediately going to Netflix and press releases without any critique from any of the scientists, with any other scientists off the team to see actually what it said, and totally just misinforming the public about how we do this kind of archaeology and how we define burial or fire usage or anything like that. Same thing with how you define species, right? And so it's a real problem with how science is covered these days. It's supposed to be fair and balanced, but it oftentimes just seems to be that some people, some teams have gotten very good at gaming the system and getting their word out without the ability for other scientists to sort of say, hey, wait a second, what you're saying makes no sense with how the rest of us are doing anything.
They could just be intellectually honest about it and say that species concepts are hard to define. They're really conceptual in nature. They have really good theoretical foundations, and they're difficult to describe. And all of that is true. You could just say some version of that. Species concepts are difficult to describe, but they're really well founded in science and in theory and empirical studies.
And we've developed some really cool technology to do genetic modification and proofs of concepts. And look at this. This is really cool. This has an implication for us to be able to modify genes in the future that can actually have an impact.
If they're successful, it's going to change human healthcare. Infertility is a thing of the past. Simple genetic diseases are a thing of the past.
Which would be really cool.
That'll be really cool, but then it raises a bunch of ethical concerns that are definitely not my area of expertise, is who has access to these technologies? Are they covered by healthcare? How expensive are they? Is the cost of them going to prevent low-income people from having access to them? These are all ethical concerns about the technologies that they're developing that also should be taken into account. Not by like me, by actual philosophers and ethicists, but it's something that we have to do.
Yeah, no, I saw the movie Gattaca. I know exactly what you mean, that this is something we need to be taken into account. That actually reminds me of a very fun diagram and point that Tori Herridge wrote in this thread on de-extincting the mammoths from a couple of years ago, where the point is about consent and things like that. To actually be able to create a woolly mammoth, well, you need to actually put this new egg, fertilized egg, into a mammoth, or an elephant, I should say. And that's not so easy to do. So there's all kinds of ethical conundrums about consent and about thinking through the impact on living animals that this kind of experimentation and like you said, even if they get out into the wild and they spread these kinds of genes, none of this stuff seems very well thought out.
But they would have you believe it is, which again is misleading, right? This is just pure disinformation. They would say that, oh no, we actually have thought these things out. Don't worry about it. Mm-hmm. They don't tell you why or the implications of what they're doing. They don't tell you what you actually should be taking seriously, what the potential ethical concerns are, what the potential environmental concerns are. They just say, trust us. And that's not how we do science.
No, it's not helping at all. And it just seems to me more like a fundraising pitch than anything else.
I think it is. The goal of doing this, the goal of doing this kind of thing is to garner that overwhelmingly popular press support. Because if you get good press coverage, then people are going to be more likely to invest in that particular company, right? So they're getting free, overwhelmingly positive press coverage at the expense of spreading false information to the public and covering up the consequences of that false information.
And at the expense of other really awesome, legitimate science getting coverage.
Yeah, totally.
Which really needs it.
Yeah, there's only so much. There's only so much time. There's only so many pages that gets covered, right? Carl Zimmer can only write so many news stories, and if he's writing about this, he's not writing about something else.
Yeah, no, that's so. Did Carl Zimmer write about this?
I think he did, actually.
Aha, that's upsetting.
I think he was critical, though.
Okay, then never mind. It's not as upsetting. 'Cause I like Carl Zimmer's writing.
But there's not that many critical stories, and they're after the fact, and people aren't going to. It's really hard to correct a lie once it's out there in the information environment.
And we shouldn't be critiquing this stuff. I mean, we should be critiquing this stuff, but I mean, we shouldn't have to. It should be presented in a fair and honest way. And we should be, then moving on to other really cool science that's presented in a fair and honest way. Yeah. So on that note, what about some of your work? You're working on sort of ancient genetics and you're thinking about modern applications of it. Is there something else we should be paying attention to in this space?
In this space?
Yeah.
Like ancient DNA space?
Ancient DNA and its impacts on medicine or stuff like that. Conservation also.
I mean, there's a lot of really interesting studies that are using ancient DNA to understand Neanderthals and Denisovans, these sort of sister lineages to humans. They're not different species, according to some of us. But if we can understand their genetic differences from us, that might tell us something about what makes us unique. There was a study that introduced a Neanderthal, I believe, a Neanderthal gene into a mouse, and they saw changes in the brain size. So that's important. It tells us something about the genetic chains that are responsible for brain size. There is evidence that there are alleles associated with adaptation to high altitudes, and that those alleles were derived from Neanderthals who mated with humans, and then we call that integration, so that those alleles integressed into humans that allowed some populations to live at particularly high altitudes. There's some evidence that Neanderthal variants that integressed into humans influence the immune system. So like we can actually learn a lot by doing this, in addition to just understanding the basic science, which is why a lot of us do things, right?
Yeah.
I just want to understand why weird things are the way they are. And I think a lot of scientists are like that.
And I think that that's what the public and especially politicians are missing out on, that so many of our scientific developments that have done good for the world, they come out of understanding basic science. They come out of curious questions that start to put together the building blocks upon which we understand these topics. And from that, we start adapting that into something worthwhile. And with all the cuts that we see in the US and in the UK and around the world, really, except for the EU, which just announced they're expanding their funding for basic science research, what we're seeing is a total, rejection of looking at basic science, and instead it's kind of science by who can attract wealthy mega donors.
I think that this is one of the problems with their disinformation, right? They're lying to the public. The public's going to believe that. Eventually, it's going to come out that actually what they were told isn't true, and that leads to a distrust in science and a distrust in scientists. And if that's the case, then why should we be funding science? And if that's the case, let's cut the NIH grant. If that's the case, let's cut the NSF budget. But those are two profoundly important funding agencies that have given us numerous important technological and medical innovations. We need to support them. But if the public doesn't want to support them because they don't have a trust in science, then you can justify cutting their budgets. Then you can justify dismantling the institutions that are responsible for these innovations.
Yeah, and when you go on fucking Joe Rogan and you praise Graham Hancock, who trashes archaeologists, and when you say the archaeology community is just crazy, where do you think you're finding so many of your direwolf specimens? It's from excavations. And so it's just like, what the hell? You're shooting yourself in the foot by critiquing us and getting our budgets cut because you're just pulling up the ladder after you start funding your company by appealing to this anti-science crowd in order to raise funds.
Yeah, that's their disinformation is having real-world consequences that are negative.
Yeah, and on the communities of people that are actually doing real science. Yeah, I think that this is fuck. So what can we do about this? Let's think. I mean, we can talk about it here. You've been very vocal on Twitter and other things like that. I would argue in your case that you should think, instead of sending out idle tweets, you should think about constructing more narratives. So when I give talks to universities and colleagues about how to engage with the public, I find that when you send off individual tweets, it doesn't do much. They sort of just disappear into the void. But when you sort of,
especially now, given the sort of restructuring of how the algorithm works.
Yeah, I know, very much so. But writing more of a coherent thread, and especially if you use that Game of Thrones image as the header, use their images against them. And I also argue this very strongly, to use what pseudoscientists do against them. That's why I went into Rogan's space to do this debate. And so, I think we need to develop more coherent strategies to combat this kind of disinformation. What on your perspective, what do you think we can do to try to combat this kind of pseudoscience and misinformation and disinformation?
Well, it's hard for us sort of scientists who work in the lab or work in theory, because we're not very good at talking to the general public. We sort of talk to each other a lot, and we use a lot of jargon, and we take certain things for granted, that the thing that I'm talking about. So we get very good at talking to each other, but we're not particularly good at talking to the public in ways that introduce difficult concepts that we're totally familiar with in ways that they can understand, because the general public is smart. If you're good at explaining it to them, then they will understand it. So I think one of the things we have to do is we have to get more people, more scientists out there talking to the public, and being good at public relations, just like the companies like Colossal are. Because
that's why I started with the penis bones, right? Like, you got to get the audience hooked. Hey, this is going to be a conversation full of penis bones, and we haven't even mentioned them for like an hour. And so,
I mean, it's hard for scientists to be able to engage in ways that use language in ways that the general public can understand, but they'll understand it if we get better at it. So, it takes practice to do that kind of thing.
One of the arguments I often make is to lose the jargon, but don't dumb things down. Because as soon as you start, because a lot of scientists, they take especially archaeologists, we're so used to communicating with children in like museums and stuff like that, because children are wowed by dinosaurs and archaeology, and so paleontology and archaeology. And so we need to learn how to communicate to an adult audience, but without all the jargon, and to also think through how to have a hook to grab their attention, which, to be honest, I have to give it to Colossal Biosciences. They're very good at that. And so I think we need to think through how to package our own material in an honest way, but in a way that actually catches the public's attention.
It's also really hard to sort of put the cat back in the bag. Once the sort of main headlines are out there, you're sort of seeming like a naysayer if you come out and say, no, none of that's right. None of that's true. Because who are they going to believe? I'm particularly negative about what they're doing when it comes to de-extinction. But it's hard to say, oh, look, the technologies are useless, because they're not useless.
Yeah, no, I agree. And but I think that some of what we need to do is teach the public that we can have an adult conversation with that kind of nuance, if you see what I mean. We can be critical of one thing and praising another thing. And, which is hard to do in our modern media sphere, where it's all sound bites and, short sentences and stuff like that. People are like, oh my God, you called everybody who believes in pseudo-archaeology a racist. And it's like, no, I fucking didn't. I talked about how there's a history of this kind of shit. Like, this is just, I'm having a conversation with adults, so deal with it,
But this is, again, where I blame the media. They have a role to play in this, right? You need to bring on experts who aren't associated with the study to critique the study and tell you if the people who did the thing are overselling it.
Yeah,
and that is almost never done.
I think that's also where there's a role for this kind of stuff, this kind of long form podcasting, which is obviously dominated so much by many anti-science people, but it's actually a format where the public sort of tunes in. They put on their earbuds while they're doing work or whatever, while they're driving long distances or whatever, and then they can actually listen to a nuanced conversation. And so I think that scientists like us, we need to embrace this kind of communication format where we can actually take the time to have a conversation like this that will resonate with various sorts of people.
While I'm happy to have the conversation with you, don't take this as an insult. I'd rather not. Because I'd rather not have to do this kind of correcting the record about someone's disinformation, right? I'd rather be in the lab. I'd rather be writing grants that I think are really fun because I want to do that cool science. So their disinformation campaign means that I have to do this instead of doing other more important things, because actually this is pretty important.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that that's where we need to remember, as J.R.R. Tolkien put it, we do not choose the world that we're born in. And we have to address it. If we want to get back into the lab, we need to make sure that there's funding for proper research. We need to make sure that it's presented to the public in a proper way so that people understand what is relevant and what is not. I think we need to be pushing for all of us to be speaking up. I mean, one of the things I make as a call to my colleagues is if every single scientist just made one interesting video on YouTube a year, your best teaching lecture, you know, at an introductory level for the intro class you teach, we could just flood the internet. And it's sort of like we need to take that responsibility because we're in a world where we are being sidelined by these kind of narratives, and it's not right. We have to do something about that.
And again, I think it's because most of us aren't used to describing things in ways that aren't full of jargon and to people who already know what we're talking about, right? So we need to understand and develop ways to talk to the general public about complex things that they totally can understand if you explain it to them in sort of a way that's simple.
See, but I'm going to push back on you. I think we actually have the training to do this. It's just we do that in our intro level university courses. So, you know, and that's why what I argue is we need to stop communicating our research. Our research is at the high level where it's already embedded in a discourse that is built on 100 years of bibliography, right? And 100 years of methods and about what species are, even from Darwin on down. And so, you know, instead we need to do a better job of teaching what species are, right? We need to be doing that introductory level lecture that we give on day one of Biology 101 or Anthro 101. I mean, I talk about this myself in my Zoar class about how wolves can mate and yet they're different species with dogs and stuff like that. And so obviously things are complex in how we define species. And, you know, even how you mentioned this evolutionary tree, at least with human evolution, we're starting to think of it more as a braided stream because we start seeing all these different lineages develop, but then they come back together and mate, Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens, for example. And so, you know, we're starting to make that complex. And I do that in like, you know, the second day, third day of like, you know, intro level archaeology. And so that's the kind of stuff that would help if the public understood the different nuances of how to define species, they could more critically evaluate the claims that Ben Lamb makes.
I mean, my class is a 400 or 500 level, and we spend a lot of time talking about species. And I spend a lot of time talking about the different kinds of species, concepts, to students who have never really heard them before. They know sort of the biological species concept, and that's usually about it. So we spend a lot of time discussing what we gain from having multiple species concepts, why each one is situationally appropriate, why we can't have just one big definition. And again, you know, if the media was doing their job and Colossal was being intellectually honest, they could include that in their statements, in their press releases. The reporters can include it in their stories. It's not hard.
No, I agree. I agree fully. All right. Shall we move on to Q&A, or do you have any last points you want to make?
No, we can do Q&A.
All right. Let me pull up the questions from my patrons and channel members. We have a few. Remember, if you're a patron or a channel member, you get to know who I have on in advance, and you can have your first dibs at asking questions. So somebody this is more of a comment, I guess. It's great to see you delving into other areas of science, and I already addressed it. This seems to be similar to the Homo naledi issue. I have a big video coming out in a few weeks on Homo naledi, where I got 4 different paleoanthropologists to discuss the issue in terms of the bad science communication and disinformation in many ways that's very similar to this situation. So I agree, it is very similar to Homo naledi issue and the way it's being communicated. And despite all the good science that the team is doing, they are focusing instead on the hype, and it's a real problem. So yeah, I agree. But this is a question for you then. The original team seems to have walked back from their original congratulatory communication. Is the new way that, I guess in that New Scientist article it was framed, is that good enough for you?
No, because today there was a USA Today story where they said that they de-extincted the direwolf, right? So they may have walked back the claims in that one article, but they're still saying that they did it.
Yeah. And they're still, as we saw, their website is still not updated at all. It was just seriously for one outlet that is mostly read by people who are scientists, and they have to subscribe. It's behind a paywall and all this kind of stuff. So it wasn't very public at all. Yeah, that's a
If
good
they
point.
stop saying it, great.
Huh?
If they
Yeah,
stop saying it, great, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with just saying, hey, we invented this technology, but instead they just spread all this disinformation.
Yeah, huge problem. Okay, in terms of conservation, how do you view de-extinction in comparison to reintroducing locally extirpated species like what is being done with the gray wolf in Colorado?
So they're locally extirpated, so they're not extinct. And
Yeah.
that's a different thing than de-extincting. That actually is an example of rewilding. And I don't know how you get informed consent from people to do that, right? I assumed that there's a engagement with the community before you introduce the gray wolves, particularly if they're farming communities or communities that herd cattle or something that could potentially be preyed upon by gray wolves. Provided you get all those kinds of approvals, I'm fine with it. I think that's actually something better. That actually is doing restoration ecology.
That actually, yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of issues with rewilding and how it's defined here in the UK too. One of she just retired, but Professor Jackie Mulville works on a lot of that on Scottish islands. But yeah, so there's a big debate about that here in the UK with rewilding and reintroducing species that have not been in landscapes for a long time. Yeah, it's a complicated one, partly because you brought up the mammoth thing where landscapes have changed so much that's a big question. If they were extirpated recently, you could reintroduce them and maybe have that impact, but there might be unintended consequences. And like you said, ranchers might just start shooting them anyway.
But I'm assuming that, before you do that you perform some kind of ecological assessment study to determine how feasible it is and what the potential consequences are, both good and negative.
Yeah. And like you said, where's the ecological modeling, Ben?
They say they've done it, but I haven't seen it.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, how does this de-extinction project think a population of these animals could live and build populations? Where would be the landscape, ecosystem, and prey, competitors, fauna/flora to live a healthy life? This is building on a lot of it. Do you want to add anything else that this question maybe suggests for you?
I mean, all of that is true. And again, you need to figure out those things before you do it. And as far as I can tell, they haven't actually figured out those things yet. They're doing the thing. So yeah, you have to do the kinds of studies to determine how something might work and the potential consequences. Have a conversation with people about that if what you're proposing to do is terraforming the planet, and then decide if that's something that we want to do.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it takes that kind of really careful research to try to think about it. All right, everybody, ask some questions in the chat. We'll take a few of them. I have pinned a few different things. One was this funny comment that is, it's not morphologically a direwolf, it's cosmetically a direwolf, which I think is very, very true. It's like putting lipstick on a pig. In many ways.
I've been saying that it's superficially resembling a direwolf.
Yeah, that works. But I do like this cosmetic. Good job, Gordon. Okay, here we go. Playing devil's advocate, if adding direwolf DNA to the red wolf population improves their survivability by adding genetic diversity, etc., is that necessarily a bad thing?
If you were to do such a thing, I wouldn't do it with direwolves. We have gray wolves. And there's a population of canids already in Texas that have a large portion of their genome that is derived from gray wolves. So we wouldn't need the direwolves to do it. If we wanted to identify potentially beneficial mutations to introduce into red wolves, we already have populations that have red wolf DNA that we could do that with. Now, whether that is feasible is a different thing. Most genetic differences between species don't have any function. We call them neutral. They have no contribution to phenotypes or morphologies. A lot of them, if you just randomly introduce them into another species, might have deleterious consequences. And it's hard to predict those deleterious consequences. Some of them will be beneficial, and it's hard to identify the beneficial ones from the other ones. So if you could do it, it might be worth doing.
That makes a lot of sense. Here's another comment that I thought was funny. Spay and neuter your experimental gene modifications, folks.
I've already said that on Twitter.
Did you? All right. This person's been following you, I imagine. Max Xavier, you got to go check out Devo Ecomed? Devo Evomed?
Evo Devomed.
Evo Devomed, sorry. Evolutionary development. All right. Are there any mutations that originate in Neanderthals or any other Homo sapiens subspecies that help us tolerate the cold, heat, or altitudes? You'd mentioned the altitudes one.
At least one. So there's a variant in a gene called EPAS1, which is important for high altitude adaptation. If I remember right, there are ones for adaptation to cold, but I don't want to say it because I can't remember it to be true.
Okay. Yeah. Wait a second. Here. Where did it go? Sorry.
That's what.
Here we go. What is your opinion on the ethical concern that gene editing, when used to cure genetic and inherited diseases, that it could bring back the idea of eugenics from its grave? That's a good question.
That is something I worry about a lot, particularly with the development of these multiplex genome editing methods, is that who has access to them and what are they used for, and who gets to decide who has access and what are they used for. It's hard to argue, at least it's hard for me to argue, that we shouldn't use them to try to correct heritable genetic diseases, cystic fibrosis, for example, hemophilia, sickle cell disease, things like that. I don't have those things, so who am I to be the one to say don't do them? I don't carry the variants that cause those things, so who am I to be the one that says don't correct them so I can have offspring that don't have these genetic disorders? I presume that's the role of government agencies and biomedical ethicists. So I do worry about it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And especially because eugenics ideas have become much more mainstream lately and much more popular with regards to archaeology, with regards to biology, with regards to fitness and health. It's become I could see this being very much misused with this kind of stuff becoming so popular. Which I think relates to this question in a sense. Is there an institution to hash out a new definition of species in biology, the way it was done with planets in astronomy? There's a geological institution that sort of has tried to weigh in on how to define the Anthropocene, for example, or not. So yeah, is there anything like that in biology?
Not really, no. There are some organizations like the International Union of Zoological Nomenclature, which defines how we name things.
Okay.
There's a certain set of rules for how we name things, but they don't tell us what's a species that gets to be named.
Okay.
The problem with species concepts is that they are usually situationally appropriate. So it would be really hard to say this is the definition of a species. For a while, we used the biological species concept, which is the one Mayer gave us, that if two populations mate and can't produce fertile offspring, they are species. And then we found that one to be problematic, so we developed some other ones. And when we found those to be problematic, we developed some other ones. And it's true that there isn't or can't be one definition. And then scientists don't like being told what to do, so we probably couldn't agree on one anyway.
I mean, that's one of the things is these pseudoscientists, they say there's like this monolith. Like I think even Ben Lamb, that clip that I had him playing, I think he was arguing against Tori Herridge and what she said about him, about these ideas of bringing back a mammoth. And so it's like there's some idea that there's a monolith in what scientists say. There's the narrative, and it's like, man, we can't fucking agree on anything. So this is why we publish so many papers arguing with each other.
I mean, it's part of the process. We're supposed to argue with each other because
of course.
When we argue, then we get to sort of the important point of the thing that we're discussing, and we find the ways to resolve that important point. Arguing is good in science.
Of course,
if we're doing it from a place of intellectual honesty.
Yeah, a place of good faith, and where we're not trying, we're not insulting each other. We're trying to argue our ideas. Yeah. Okay, how about this? Is it true that elephants are evolving smaller and smaller tusks?
I don't know about smaller and smaller. There is a genetic variant in African elephants that causes tusklessness. And I believe there has been a study showing that variant is increasing in frequency. I don't know about
which would make sense with all the poachers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. They claim they bring back woolly mammoths to stomp down the permafrost in the Russian tundra. We've already covered this. It's certainly not a justifiable conclusion because you need millions of these woolly mammoths to be bred. All right, last question. Nope, wrong thing. Here we go. Is the situation the same with woolly mammoth meatballs, lab-grown meat, a few years ago, a marketing stunt that doesn't match the science?
I mean, I think it's true. There is lab-grown meat. But I don't know if you can make woolly mammoth lab-grown meat, because you would have to do the same thing, right? You would have to have a complete woolly mammoth genome, go through the cloning thing, and without a complete woolly mammoth genome, sort of it ends right there.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess we could find some woolly mammoth meat from permafrost and turn them into meatballs.
I mean, there are stories of early explorers having done that.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. It was really great to have you on, Vinny. You're doing really cool public outreach, and maybe we'll get you on to talk about your research at some point, because I think we should be promoting real research. And you know, you're close enough. You're doing mammoths and things like that. Humans hunted mammoths, and I'm an equal comer to supporting all kinds of science. So I think that that's important. And then otherwise, for everybody else, I'm planning, I think, on live streaming on Thursday with an Italian archaeologist who's going to go into the depths on the pseudoscientists that promoted those megastructures under the pyramids. And then they believe in demons and stuff like that. So, you know, even though they're legitimate chemists, they're not really legitimate public communicators. And then I think Friday, hopefully, we're going to have my response to Joe Rogan calling me a bitchy, weak man. Yeah. So look forward to it. Vinny, thank you. And Colossal Biosciences, 2 thumbs down.
if they want to engage in a public debate, I'm more than happy to do so.
I will tell them, look, I will gladly host a professional debate. I think we should all be engaging in good faith. Like I said, I let me see if I can find the tweet. I had it up, I think. I specifically invited them on publicly. Before I even got in touch with you, I was willing to just host them and have a conversation about the problems with this kind of stuff. Here we go. I found it. So he goes, you can call them. This is from April 14th. So we're talking nearly 2 months ago. You can call them dire wolves, colossals dire wolves, weird looking puppies, genetically modified wolves with dire wolf alleles. It makes no difference to me. No one is asking you to read our news, follow our company, our papers, whatever makes you happy. I say, sure, Ben, but you realize your public communication impacts scientists and science communicators who focus on related topics. As a scholar who studies ancient animals and has a public profile, I'm swarmed with questions about your work, and I'm still figuring out how to reply. I'm also curious why you promoted this pseudo-archaeology on Joe Rogan. And these claims are directly antagonistic towards me, my colleagues in our discipline. But if you'd like to productively collaborate with the science community, I'm happy to host you and /or Beth on my YouTube. I don't have a big audience, but a lot of people in this little field, they know who I am. They follow it. They're colleagues with me. And so, you know, if you want to come on, I'm happy to host either of you two individually, and Vinny here is happy to also come on, and I won't even say that this is disinformation. I'll let you explain yourself, and I will critique it in a polite way so that you have a chance to explain yourself to a scientist who is critical. And I'm sure you would do the same, and I would be more than happy to do that. But like I said, I tried emailing Beth, and she did not reply. That was about a week ago. So I don't think they're interested. And Ben never replied to me at all. So he very clearly ignored me because he replied to other people in the thread, but not me, even though it was all in response to my response to him up above about the morphology stuff. So I think he already knew to dislike me from Joe Rogan. He probably sees me as a bitchy, weak little man.
I mean, I'm sure Ben Lamb doesn't even think about me that much. So
I doubt it, but he's clearly in that community where he's happy to praise Graham Hancock and critique all archaeologists instead of productively engaging with actual archaeologists and people who study these animals. So yeah, no, thank you again. I think it was great. And thank you everybody for showing up. Let's end with our outro music again from R.M. Brown. Become a YouTuber, and then people start making songs about your name if you have a crazy name. That's the lesson here. Thank you all.
zippo, friend on zippo, friend.